All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation in our LAGB Activism in Progress series. So for those of you who not joined us before, this is an occasional online talk series that we started this semester, we being the LAGB Subcommittee on Social and Racial Justice. The LAGB, for those of you who are very new to this, is the Linguistic Association of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's the UK's linguistic, one of our professional bodies. This is one of our last presentations for the semester, so just in case you missed it, in a couple of weeks we will have Anne Charity Hutley, I think on Wednesday, 11th of December. Today, I'm very happy to welcome and introduce, from coming live from 2-3 doors down the hall, our student Grace Clark and my colleague Christian Ilbury. One of the nice things about this presentation series is that it's easy to leave people to tell us what they want to tell us about themselves and the work they do. So much as I appreciate Grace, who's one of our final year undergraduate students here in PPLS, and Christian, who's my colleague and who I think many of us know. I'm also happy to leave it to them to tell us about linguistic discrimination in higher education and the important work they've been doing as linguists, as activists, as members or presidents, as the case may be, of the 93% Club, and so on. So with that in mind, we'll have about 40-ish minutes for the presentation, which will be recorded, and then around 20 minutes for a Q&A, which will not be recorded. And with that, Grace and Christian, over to you.
Cool. Right. Great. So we are today going to be speaking about linguistic discrimination in higher education, and we're going to be introducing an approach that we've been taking here at the University of Edinburgh. That is a collaboration between me, a staff member, and Grace, a student who is particularly active in terms of campaigning for students who are from state schools and their rights at the university. So I'm just going to jump into the context here. So as a sociolinguist, the field was basically founded on the notion of serving social justice, so looking at linguistic injustice, looking at differences in language and how we can use that knowledge to basically campaign for the rights of minoritized speakers. And so within this, we have seen that there is a core goal of sociolinguistics from about the 60s, the emergence of the field, to campaign for the rights of minoritized and non-standard speakers. So this has been, some of you will be familiar with Labov's famous conceptualization of the principle of error correction. Basically, the idea that if we have scientific knowledge that contradicts widespread belief about a language system or language variety, we have a duty of care as professional linguists to campaign on this issue. So to some degree, this has been pervasive throughout the field. It's something that people have been thinking about for some time. So I'm not talking about something particularly new. Some of you will be familiar with the work, for instance, that Labov was involved in the case of Ann Arbor and various other cases with regard to the so-called Ebonics debate, or the campaign for African American vernacular English to be recognized actually as a variety of American English, as opposed to being sidelined by the educational and governmental systems. This topic equally has become more recently debated within sociolinguistics, as linguists have returned to essentially discussions of language and social justice. So you have seen, for instance, research on critiques of the principle of error correction, for instance, Mark Lewis's work, where he basically argues that the principle of error correction is socially naive in that it doesn't actually address the systemic issues that underlie the language judgments that people make. We've also seen the emergence of racial linguistics in the US, and more recently has been adopted in the UK by people like Cushing, where there has been a greater focus on the ways in which language comes to be associated with racialized ways of being and speaking. There's also been a push within sociolinguistics and socially minded linguistics for considering accent and language as part of a broader campaign in higher education towards decolonizing curricula. So the argument from linguistics is, you should equally decolonize your ears or decolonize your linguistic practices. So language as part of the colonial enterprise should equally be deconstructed and critiqued. There's been particular focus within educational and applied linguistics with a focus on how language comes to be a form of social injustice. So as I already said, for instance, work by Ian Cushing has looked at how bodies like Ofsted, so the regulatory educational authority for England, has, for instance, embedded standard language ideology in their practices. But what I want to argue today, and what we want to argue, is most of this work has considered these issues as real-world issues. And by real-world, I mean outside of academia. So there is now a lot of research which has examined how speakers are discriminated against, or how language users are discriminated against on the basis of the way that they speak, sign, or interact. But this research has focused on domains such as law. So for instance, Cherise King and John Rickford's paper looking at Rachel Jantel and the ways in which her testimony in court is basically refuted on the grounds of linguistic discrimination. There has been quite a lot of research, some of which I was involved in the Accent Bias in Britain project, that looked at whether particular candidates who spoke in particular accents were rated less competent than, for instance, their received pronunciation speaking colleagues. There's also, as I said earlier, been a lot of work that has looked at how secondary school students experience linguistic discrimination, and also how this accent bias is essentially woven into the educational system through regulatory bodies like Ofsted. So, for instance, Ian has done a ridiculous amount of research on this. Right, it's impossible to not mention Ian's work here, and Julia too has focused quite heavily on this context. And finally, there has been some market research-based research on creative industry. So if you know anything about TV, film, etc., a lot of hiring done there is based on nepotism. As such, there is very low social mobility within that industry. And so increasingly, entertainment industries, creative industries have become aware in the ways in which social class, and relatedly accents that are related to social class positions, can limit particular candidates in those positions. So I myself has done some consultancy work for Netflix. So Netflix are now thinking about this. People in the real world are thinking about this. But what we want to argue in this talk, and this is why me and Grace have been working on this, is we actually think, as professional linguists at a university, these issues are in our backyard. And we really need to think about the ways in which we, as part of a system of higher education, are complicit in the maintenance, circulation, and promotion of linguistic inequality. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so before I delve into this topic, I just want to say, we've had some discussions about this for the last two years, and I think we can identify a number of ways in which universities are complicit in this type of language ideology. So first, in terms of their selection process, right? So if you look at a university like the University of Edinburgh, where we are now, and which I will go into in more detail in a moment, if you look at the widening participation figures, they are very low. In comparison to some comparative universities. So there is already a bias towards a particular type of student who speaks a particular type of way implicit in that. There's also bias in the types of discrimination they address. I am EDI director for our school, and our dignity and respect policy at the moment does not actually mention anything about language or accent. Equally, in the Equality Act 2010, nothing about accent, nothing about language. Also, who is represented in academia? We know academia to be, for many years, an ivory tower. Who has access to the remit of academia is skewed towards non-working class people. It's skewed towards people who have the economic and cultural capital to be able to access it. Equally, in the dominance of English in academic publishing and instruction, right, there has been a lot of applied linguistic research on how academia is already skewed towards native speakers or L1 speakers of English on the basis of English being dominant. And equally, even in our own field, so sure, we're talking about our backyard, but even closer to home, right, there is a kind of tension as to what is even considered linguistics, right? So quite a lot of people have written about how some socially oriented aspects of linguistics are often sidelined in the debate as to what linguistics actually is. So, we are at Edinburgh, and it's impossible to talk about this issue without thinking about the ways in which this university has embedded elitism, embedded a type of accent bias, embedded a type of linguistic discrimination through these practices. So quite recently, within the last couple of weeks, there has been quite a few news stories on elitism and snobbery at the university. So this is a BBC article which emerged in relation to a social media post made by a student-run newspaper, the Edinburgh Tab. And what you actually see is beyond this headline, which speaks to class, if you look at the content of the actual news story, you'll see that it refers explicitly to accent bias and linguistic discrimination. So this is a student called Shanley. Shanley is running the Scottish Student Mobility Society, which has emerged from this. And it's basically campaigning for the rights of Scottish students. And she says, my accent has changed so much since starting at uni because I was getting comments if I said a word like canny. They like to point it out. She also said tutors would ask Scottish students to repeat themselves or to speak more clearly. Accent bias is one of the biggest issues, and they made assumptions from our accents on our intelligence levels and whether we would not be friends or not. We again see these types of discourses emerge in other newspaper articles. These are from the year before last, right? We see a repeated incident of accent discrimination again here. So Lillian, in her time at university, said she's already had experiences of being shamed for her accent. Just in Freshers Week, I was told that I sound really rough. So we see these discourses basically on a cyclical basis every year at the moment that we see this kind of occurring. So why is this a problem at the University of Edinburgh? Well, the University of Edinburgh has a higher than average number of privately educated number of students. If you think about private schools and received pronunciation, which is often sometimes described as a public school accent, right, you can see how the higher percentage of privately educated students at 35% here in comparison to, let's say, Queen Mary University of London, which has only 14% of privately educated students. You can see how this might play a role in the perception of received pronunciation as a particularly elite accent. Because of this, Edinburgh often is perceived to be an elite university. It's elite in terms of the privately educated students number here, not our perception of the university itself. The widening participation figure is also particularly low. At the University of Edinburgh, it's 10.2% of students come from a widening participation background versus if you think about the University of Glasgow, which at least is not in the news for these kind of issues all the time, 16.7% of students come from a widening participation background there. In a course that I teach called Dialects of Britain and Northern Ireland, when I have taught about received pronunciation, the comments I often get that this is the University of Edinburgh accent. So you can see here that there is a long-standing tradition and association between a particular way of speaking and a particular orientation to an academic life. But, you know, like I'm an Edinburgh academic, Grace is based at Edinburgh, and obviously we want to, you know, address these issues in our own backyard. But I equally don't think that this is an issue that's specific to Edinburgh. If we look beyond Edinburgh, we can find very many examples of students experiencing classism, experiencing accent bias. So this student here, Nina from Stockton-on-Tees, experienced similar types of accent bias at the University of Warwick. She says it sounds ridiculous, but I only realised I had what people regarded as a strong regional accent when I first began my undergraduate studies. Mocking of my accent was immediate, and I was shocked at the perceptions of people from the Northeast, and so on. Similar types of discourses emerge at the University of Birmingham, at Durham University, and I would argue that they are in every university. So we really need to think of this as a problem more generally of higher education as opposed to a problem of the University of Edinburgh or of Russell Group universities or elite universities, anything like that. So just before I continue, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So obviously as linguists, and I would hope that we all take this approach, we are obviously descriptive. We take a descriptive view on language. We're trying to describe what people do, not what people should do. And we dismantle the notion of standard English by complicating this by showing that actually it's basically an ideology. And when we're talking about accent, the idea of accented English is a misnomer since it is just a pronunciation associated with a particular social identity, like social class, region, age, etc. And since we're all from somewhere, we're all some age, we all have an accent. And so bias then comes into accent when people use simplified ways of speaking, simplified ways of thinking about particular accents and the people that speak them to make judgments on them. This is what we are calling linguistic discrimination. So using those stereotypes to judge unrelated traits. So whilst accent does cue sometimes to things like sexuality, gender, class, it does not cue to things like intelligence, competence, or trustworthiness, but people make those judgments regardless, right? And this is problematic to us because language can function as a proxy for other forms of discrimination. So sure, in Equality Act, age, sex, sexual orientation are protected characteristics. You can't discriminate against anyone on these basis of these. But you can do this through the back door, right? You just say the way that they speak is not the right way of speaking for your particular company or for the particular student. And this is problematic because accent, language, and relatedly social class is not protected under the Equality Act. So you can explicitly, if you wish, make comments about the way that somebody speaks. So people legally and do discriminate on the basis of linguistic difference. This is a problem in the UK because, as many of you will know, there are, as a country, as a nation that is absolutely obsessed with social class, right? We see that certain accents are rated much more highly in terms of prestige than others, right? And this is a recurrent pattern over the past 50 years. So in research in 1969, it was found that received pronunciation, what most people think of Queen's or for obvious reasons now King's English, and think of as a social elite accent, is often rated very high in terms of its prestige, whereas other accents are associated with former industrial cities or towns like Birmingham or Liverpool are rated much lower, and likewise ethnic minority accents are rated much lower. And this is particularly a problem in the UK because, as I say, the class associations that many people have. So this is Fiona Hill, who was the former National Security Council Director for Russia. And you'll hear in a minute, in the impeachment inquiry, she speaks about her social class background and her accent and the fact that her accent might have acted as a barrier to her social mobility in the UK.
I grew up poor with a very distinctive working class accent. In England, in the 1980s and 1990s, this would have impeded my professional advancement. This background has never set me back in America.
Yep, so we see there that actually accent may function as a form of social mobility barrier. This was also something that we found in the Accent Bias in Britain project. So essentially 10 speakers of 5 different accents were recorded in a mock interview giving a response to an interview question. And then participants were asked to rate the candidate on the basis of their perceived job suitability for the position of a trainee lawyer. And what you should be able to see here is that amongst the older people, so probably the people who are going to be on hiring panels, They rated the working class London accents and multicultural London English and estuary English as much lower in terms of job suitability than, for instance, received pronunciation, general Northern English, or urban West Yorkshire English. So again, we see that accent is likely to function as a form of social mobility barrier. In our Sutton Trust report that we published in November 2022, we found that this was particularly pronounced at university. So university students had high levels of self-consciousness about their accent, particularly in relation to whether it would affect their ability to succeed in the future. This was also marked, not just for everyone, but for a particular demographic of students from the north of England. As you will hear Grace speak about in a minute, this is particularly pronounced for some particular students. So even before I came to Edinburgh, when we wrote this report, Edinburgh kept coming up. This is, for instance, a quote from one of the participants. I regularly felt disadvantaged. I was once asked out of context if my parents worked in the coal mines. The coal mines, obviously, for us, conjures up a particular type of working class identity and also Northern England identity. I was also asked if I grew up in a council house, so social housing for those of you who aren't familiar with that term. In my experience, accent and class are often conflated in these situations. As an undergrad at Edinburgh Uni, I was discriminated against regularly because of my Lancashire accent. The first year of my undergrad, consciously spoke with a stronger Lancashire accent as a form of protest. And we obviously would hope that most people do this, right? Speak stronger, right? Like lean into your identity. But I think very many people actually feel the opposite, right? They feel silent. And so they don't speak, they don't contribute. So we really want to break this down. We think that actually this is a cause to action. It should be a cause to action for all linguists. And I think, you know, when we give these talks normally, it seems quite depressing because we're pointing out all these things that are awful about classism and about elitism. But actually in our work in accent bias, we found that one of the most effective solutions is simply telling people that this is a problem, right? Like I think the level at which people know about this is very low, right? It's probably so low that we linguists can really contribute something effective to this. So even in the Accent Bias in Britain project, I had developed some training resources to work on this. Okay, so now what we're going to do in the second part of our talk is talk about what we've been doing at the University of Edinburgh to tackle these issues. And what we would hope is that this could be essentially a blueprint for other universities to replicate the kind of collaborative work that we've been doing. So this is a student-started collaboration. So me, a sociolinguist in the department here, have been working with Grace, who is the president of the 93% Club. She will be speaking about that in a minute. Grace is a philosophy student. We're in the same school, but we have primarily been working on this issue in relation to our student staff positions. We've also engaged with Tackling Elitism, who have similar kind of goals and aims, and more recently now the Scottish Social Mobility Society, who have emerged in relation to the recent issues on classism and anti-Scottish sentiment. What we are trying to do here is basically combine linguistic approaches and linguistic knowledge with a student experience, right? We can't address this problem unless we know what students are experiencing, right? So we really need to engage with students as stakeholders, as people who experience the university in a way that we do not, to tackle this issue. And the ultimate goal is to raise awareness of accent bias and dismantle the ideologies of deficient language that seem to be completely embedded in just about every area of the university. And I will speak more on whether this is an altruistic or kind of an ideological, obsession later on in the talk. But for now, I will hand over to Grace, who will introduce the 93% Club.
So hi everyone, I'm Grace. I'm the president of the 93% Club here at Edinburgh. Just to kind of give you a bit of background on the 93% Club, we're part of a network of clubs across different UK universities. The first club was originally set up in Bristol by a woman called Sophie Pender in 2016-2017 time, and has since spread, like I said, to over 50 universities. And the 93% Club is now a registered charity and a foundation, and they do their own thing alongside supporting the clubs as well. Yeah, we've existed here since 2020. If you aren't aware, the 93% stands for, in the UK, 93% of the whole population is state educated. So it basically just means you didn't pay for your education in any way. So we do include, like, you know, comprehensive state school, grammar school, basically anything that's not private. But when it comes to these universities like Edinburgh, that percentage doesn't match up. So as Christine said before, like, the percentage of privately educated students here is much higher. It's somewhere between about 35 and 40% here, depending on like what year and what statistics you look at. So, you know, that means then like 60 to 65% of state educated students, which is obviously much, much lower than 93%. So basically, like I say, we exist to represent state educated students, but that obviously means that there's a lot of crossover with class and working class students. You know, I would definitely consider myself working class, and we also have a lot of crossover with wine and participation students, which again, if you're not familiar, the term wine and participation, it basically refers to anyone who has had some kind of barrier to accessing higher education. Frustratingly, the definition differs between universities, but, you know, it's people from like lower socioeconomic backgrounds, like your parents' income. If you went to a quite low progression school, which is basically just like if very few people from your school go to university, if you're a refugee or asylum seeker, if you're care experienced, if you're a carer, a mature student, adult returner, anything like that. So yeah, basically that's kind of how we interact with the class system. Obviously, as Christine said, like, the class system in the UK is very different, and the club is, although we, you know, have branched out in some ways and include international students, like, this is very much focused on UK students and the experience of UK students, because, yeah, we're just obsessed with class in this country. You know, and so kind of we're breaking down to staff that, you know, what the difference is between working class and middle class. And unfortunately, Tony Blair was not right, and we are not all middle class now. You know, so like I say, myself as a working class student is going to have had a very different experience to sort of my middle class peers, and we're really trying to sort of bring that home to staff. Yeah, I mean, I think this is something really important, and I think often gets forgotten by academics, is that university is not a level playing field. And I think this is even a perception that I had when I came to university, was that suddenly everybody was on an equal footing with each other. But in reality, that is just not the case. I struggled my way through my first year. You know, I couldn't afford my rent. I was struggling for money. I needed to find a job. All this kind of stuff. You know, on top of having moved to a new city and, yeah, been in a new place, studying a new course, and all of those things can have a really big impact on students. But I think staff are sometimes so set on, they want to treat everyone the same, but in reality that it's just not like a helpful approach to it. You know, in class and accent, like I say, will continue to affect students. I can say that, you know, you can have two students who are in sort of like an equal like mental health crisis, for example, but if one student comes from a wealthy background and one doesn't, the difference, you know, in their ability to get through that at university can be really different, because the student with the financial privilege will often be able to pay for counselling and, you know, pay for support and be able to take time off if they need it. Whereas, you know, for the less fortunate student, that just often won't be the case, and they've got to go on waiting lists. And so dropout rates for working class state educated students are often much, much higher. And again, like Christina said, like the fact that it's not a characteristic makes a really big difference. You know, I had a tutor say to me my first year, like, he could tell he was privately educated based on people's writing. And if, you know, that was true and he happened to be nominated against and he'd read something and gone, oh yes, this person was privately educated like myself, I'm going to give them a higher mark. There's absolutely nothing you could do about that. And yeah, universities are not seeing this as an issue that needs addressing. It's not kind of got there in terms of its sort of relevance and its salience and just how much it permeates everyday life for students. So this is a little bit about our State School Pride campaign. So basically at the club, we kind of have like three main goals. So we do socials, we do professional development, and we do campaigning. So obviously that's what I'm going to talk about here. So this was started in 2022 and it was a short video series, basically of just students sitting down and sharing their experience of being state educated, sort of the good, the bad, the ugly, the in-between. Yeah, we wanted to give students a voice, but also for these videos to be a form of representation. We're really lucky that we have a really good social media presence. And, you know, so by posting them on our social media, we were able to, for people to watch the videos and hear their own experiences sort of reflected back to them. We then repeated the campaign in 2023 and focused primarily on Scottish students. And then in 2024, we repeated it last academic year, but start of this calendar year, and focused particularly on accent discrimination as part of this work we're doing in Christian. Yeah, I mean, it's been really powerful and has been really impactful. That article that you saw where, you know, a student said she was described as rough, that came out of the 2024 video series. We've also recently as well campaigned to introduce a wine and participation liberation officer at the student union here, which again is just trying to sort of increase representation, fill some of these gaps. We never want to take away from existing representation and things around, like, you know, there's a women's officer, disabled officer, BME officer, LGBTQ officer, trans and non-binary officer. We don't want to take away from that. We just want to add to it, because, you know, like I say, people who've had those barriers to accessing higher education, often from these working class backgrounds, will just not see themselves represented, and hopefully it's small things like this that will, you know, make a difference to those, you know, stats at the start of how many WP students come here. So this is our first video. So this is Catherine from 2023, who's a Scottish student, and this is her sort of sharing her experience.
Can you see the video? Hopefully.
Hi, I'm Catherine and I'm a second year at the University of Edinburgh doing English and Scottish literature, and I'm from Glasgow. I don't think there's like one big thing. I think it's just like there's like little things that are mentioned. Like I had a Scottish literature lecturer mimic my own accent back to me when she had an English accent, and that was a pretty insulting moment, seeing as the piece she was reading from had been in Latin and translated into modern English, and I just thought that was very inappropriate. And then the next week a lecturer said, "Oh, she has such a good reading aloud voice." I went, "Oh, great." One of the authors of a book wrote themselves in, and they were a Scottish person and they were a working class author, so they wrote themselves in as a Scottish working class person. And the tutor asked, "Oh, why do you think he wrote himself in at the end?" And a girl said, "Oh, it was to portray Scottish working class people as untrustworthy." And I was kind of sat there and I'm the only Scottish person in the room. You've just said something that I don't think you thought about, but it immediately made me go, "Oh, I'm not like anyone else in this room. You know, anything I bring to this conversation, it will immediately be seen as, oh, she's just starting a fight." I think the student body is very guilty often of making very quick comments about just how ridiculous we sound, or how, you know, we sound less intelligent, or the way we speak is so unintelligible that they aren't even going to bother to listen. So I don't think necessarily they have a problem with Scottish students. I think they've got a problem when Scottish students start trying to share their experiences. Kind of constant reminders that somehow at this university, even though like you are state educated, you are one of the majority of students in the UK, like you are still somehow other. I think if I could go back and speak to first year me, I would say don't bite your tongue. Just because you're the only Scottish voice in the room doesn't mean you're the only voice not worth listening to. The idea of being state school proud, I think it's less about being proud and more about being confident. You've earned your place here just as much as everyone else, and you have ideas that are worth sharing, and no matter what your voice sounds like or the kind of background you come from, that doesn't impact your intelligence at all. Clubs like the 93% Club kind of take initiative and go, no, this is a group of people that are here, that are learning at this university, that deserve a place here. Representation that I don't think people necessarily always think is important if they aren't from that world. And I think to see their voices are heard and their voices are seen as valid and just as intelligent and just as worthy of listening to, it kind of helps with the overall university experience.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay, so we did have another video, but in the interest of time, we will skip over that one. If there's time at the end, we'll come back to it. So just to say more about what we're doing here, I'm just going to hide this, sorry, which keeps on popping up. So what we've been doing, so this is a picture of me, Grace, and then two faces you probably recognise, Julia Snell and Ian Cushing. And around this time last year, we organised a sellout event called Speaking Out, Tackling Accent Bias at the Leeds University. And the purpose of this event was basically to bring awareness to this issue. So we co-organised this. It was a student-staff collaboration, also with Tackling Elitism. And we had Julia and Ian come to speak on this as an academic issue. We also had a very large student panel where students could share their voices. And I think this was particularly effective in raising this to the point of the university realising that it was an issue. We initially booked a room of 100 capacity that sold out. We booked another room for 150 that sold out. And we eventually ended up with one of the largest lecture theatres on campus, 250, and that sold out. So people clearly realise that this is an issue, and people are clearly interested in coming to even an event that's at 6 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. So clearly people recognise this as an issue and are happy to engage with it. So I really think we as linguists need to capitalise on this interest. Here is a picture actually of the event. We've also been collaborating on developing training on accent bias. We've now given workshops to a variety of different departments. And this training really focuses on the basics of linguistic discrimination. As I said, and I will argue a bit later, it's a very low bar, right? It's quite clear from our training that some people have never really thought about this as an issue. And some people have never really thought about what linguistic discrimination can look like when it's related to social class. So we've been spending about 15 minutes in department meetings, but we also have a much longer version of this training. We'd be happy to share the kind of things that we've been doing. And the point of doing it in a department meeting is to avoid people who always self-select, right? We know in EDI that people who come to EDI things are usually the yes people. In a department meeting, most people are forced to be there, and they're a captive audience. So this is an opportunity to speak to those people. And as I said before, we're using this staff-student collaboration to talk about the accent bias, the Sutton Trust research, but also to hear it from the students, right? But we can't talk about this issue without knowing what these guys are going through. So whilst it is, some of you who might engage with social linguistics might know of the principle of error correction, and you might be thinking, well, hasn't Lewis already critiqued this? And, isn't this just altruistic and not really, going to make any difference? Well, it is also doing something in terms of intervention, right? So we are correcting the beliefs to some extent, but we're also doing something active here. We also are leading on developing online resources for this training. So beyond us going into department meetings, there is previous resources I developed for accent bias, such as an interactive quiz, and these training resources here on the left. And we're going to be developing something very similar for the university. Beyond this, I think we simply just need to bang a drum a bit louder, right? I've done quite a lot of media work on this. So I've been a part of the Perspectives podcast, which is an internal podcast. I've spoken to BBC, Radio 4, and various other different media outlets about this. And also we have worked together to kind of raise the visibility of things like accent. Even these little stickers that Grace and campaigns and the society got made up, they really make a difference, right? You see them around campus now, and you can see people realizing that this is something that actually we should be proud of. You shouldn't change the way that you speak. So, just before we end, I just want to, I'm anticipating that someone who's listening to us now might be just like, well, isn't this principle of error correction just wrapped up in a load of stickers and whatever? And I just want to address like Lewis's critique. So he claims that the principle of error correction is socially naive, as it doesn't jointly address material conditions and social positions supported by these representations. In other words, it suggests that the problem is language, when really the problem is systemic issues like racism or classism. And yeah, to some degree, I understand this, but that assumes that linguistics has or is actively campaigning on these issues. And in the UK, we haven't had a tradition like the US where this was something that people actively campaigned on. You can find examples, sure, Jenny Cheshire was an active campaigner on this, but they are fewer and far between in comparison to the US. And equally, at accent bias at Edinburgh, we're dealing with a different beast. We're dealing with social class, right? And so whilst Lewis has a point with regard to racism in the US and African American English, we're dealing with something that's different here at the University of Edinburgh. I'm sure race interacts with things in different ways at different universities. At the University of Edinburgh, it's consistently social class and anti-Scottish sentiment. So in our view, it's not just principle of error correction, this is actual change, right? I am now director of EDI for the school. It's part of our EDI strategy. It's now part of the widening participation strategy of the university. So we would argue that as linguists, we really need to play a role in actively contributing to strategies in EDI, strategies in WP, and really push for accent to be recognised at the same level of other forms of discrimination. We also think that this is particularly an issue because for WP students, for widening participation students, the focus is often on, well, can we recruit WP students? But when they're here, how are we supporting them, right? We need to think about retention. As Grace said earlier, WP students and state school students have higher numbers of dropout rates because often they're not supported when they are recruited. We also think it's important to have visibility in HE, right? The reason why I'm working on this, because I'm state school educated, I'm from working class background. It's important to have people who are actively campaigning on these issues. And as I said before, it's pretty clear that this knowledge about WP even or accent bias is very low. And we can't assume that people know this stuff already. So sure, come at me with the critique of principle of error correction, but if people know nothing, then we need to do some kind of basic knowledge. So the takeaway that we get in every training session is, how do I address accent bias in the classroom? Some people recognize it and they're like, okay, well, cool, you've told me it's an issue. How do I address this? And I think this is where, as linguists, well, we have, a very simple answer here, right? You focus on what people say and not how they say it. And if you encounter linguistic discrimination, deal with it like any other form of discrimination. You shut it down, right? And when we give this response, you can see that people suddenly realize that they can address this, and we hope they will. So that's the end of our soapboxy talk about accent bias and linguistic discrimination. There's probably a chance for some questions. If you're interested about any of our work, then hopefully these QR codes work. If they don't work, I can give you the links and you can access them directly. But I guess there's a little time now for some questions.
All right. Yeah, many thanks to both of you. We will just stop the recording now. And in the meantime, I see we already have a few hands, so audience can feel free to use the raise hand function on Zoom or drop a question in the chat or send it directly to me.